something that's really, I think, actually quite revolutionary. And I know we had meetings the other day about how GVP, Global Village Project, has the opportunity to grow and to expand and to reach into new opportunities to showcase the work they've been doing with new American girls who have education interrupted. So thank you, Mary Lou, for that introduction. I thought maybe that I could, instead of speechifying to you, I could just tell you a little bit about where I come from, my background, and we could take most of the time for a little town hall meeting with benefits. We've got wonderful iced tea and snacks and everything, very lovely home. I grew up in Tallahassee, Florida. I went to the school at the University of Florida. My degree is in food science and human nutrition. My father worked for the Department of Corrections for the state of Florida for 40 years. He was the chief designer of prisons in Florida, which at the time I thought was kind of a weird job. I went, take your son to work day, take your child to work day, and I kind of went to his office and there was like a drafting board. And I remember him describing how he had this new idea of how to design prisons to be, in his way, a little bit more efficient and compassionate. And at the time I was like, I don't really know what that means. But he actually won an award for a new design in the prison system in Florida, which, by the way, Florida is one of the highest incarceration rates in the country. And so he was a government worker for 40 years. My mother worked for the Attorney General's office for decades and then went into an employment discrimination law practice and actually led and won a landmark case lawsuit against the Tallahassee Police Department for employment discrimination of a black female major who had been passed over for promotion, whereas her white counterparts had been promoted time and time again. And she actually got the Thurgood Marshall Award from the local NAACP in the mid-90s for that work. And I remember going to that gala and not really knowing who Thurgood Marshall was and anything about this, but these are the kind, this is the people I was around, growing up. I got involved in politics probably when I was 17 years old. And I would like to say that it was for a really noble reason, and there was things going on in the world that I had to address. But the reality is I got involved in politics because of a girl. I was dating my high school sweetheart at the time, and she would invite me over to her grandparents' house for Sunday dinner, and her entire family would sit at this table and they would talk about foreign affairs and politics and policy, and I had no idea what they were talking about. And because I wanted to impress her, I was like, well, could you just, tell me, Camille, please tell me what I should read, because I don't know what's going on. And so she handed me The Nation magazine, Harper's, in these times, the New York Times. I started reading, the liberal, progressive, journals, and it began to kind of, spin wheels in my head about things that were going on in our society and the world that I didn't feel was right. And it got to a point where I had read so much that I was arguing with her uncles and her parents, about things that we should be doing, and it sort of sparked my curiosity. I went to school at the University of Florida. At the time, actually, I really was planning a running career. I was one of the top cross-country runners in high school in the state of Florida, and I was intent upon, becoming this, world champion runner. But 1 month into my freshman year, September 11th, 2001, changed everything. And the world got real small. And all of a sudden, things that were happening around the world became important to me. We were being affected by it. Particularly not just because we were attacked on that day, but what happened after it. We started the Afghan War and then the Iraq War. And I got involved with an anti-war group at the University of Florida. And I spent 2.5 years protesting the Iraq War and rallying against George W. Bush. And I felt like, yes, we are doing exactly what I had read about in the 60s and 70s. That's how you build movements. You have to have rallies and meetings. And then we lost that election, and George W. Bush got reelected. And I was confused. I was like, well, why didn't we win? We did all the things you're supposed to do. And then I actually realized that in order to win elections, you have to go out and talk to voters. And you have to talk to people and persuade them. It doesn't just happen on the streets. It happens at the doors. And so when I found myself moving to Atlanta in 2005, I decided that I wasn't going to pursue my career in nutrition. At that point, had my degree, but I was going to actually learn about politics and organizing. And so I got a job as a door-to-door canvasser for the Georgia Sierra Club, late 2005 into 2016, knocking on doors to get petition signatures for this crazy idea called the Beltline. And people thought we were crazy. Okay, I actually got arrested one day for knocking on doors in Buckhead. Some woman did not like that I was in her neighborhood and spent 9 hours in Atlanta jail. Got bailed out at 2 a.m. and we went back out to that same neighborhood the next day, knocking on doors. I skipped her house, of course. And that led into a campaign for state senate in Athens, working for Jane Kidd, who had been recently gerrymandered into what was a Democratic Senate seat. It actually was Brian Kemp's state Senate seat, but he was running for Secretary of State, and his brother-in-law, Bill Cowser, was going to run for his Senate seat, and he drew him a perfect state Senate seat. But we worked on that campaign. We campaigned in Athens, Oconee, and Walton County, all the way up to Loganville, very conservative. We lost that election, but Jane Kidd ran and became the state party chair, and so I worked for the state Democratic Party through the 2008 election as a DNC and Obama staffer. I was an organizer. I ran the voter file during the 2008 campaign, helping organize and train canvassers across Georgia for the 2008 election. After that election, I went to work for Congressman John Barrow. I was his fundraiser for 2.5 years. It was through that campaign I learned what the commitment it takes to be a U.S. congressman, the amount of time and energy it takes to serve your constituents. There were some weeks where I would pick him up at his house in Savannah at 7 a.m., and we would travel the district for town hall meetings, donor meetings, fundraisers, and we would end the night at 9 p.m., and then we would start back over again at 7 a.m., and we would do that for weeks and weeks and weeks. He was one of the few Democrats to survive the Tea Party wave in 2010. From there, I went to work on a campaign for mayor in Savannah. I ran a campaign of a council member who was running for mayor of Savannah in 2011. We got into a runoff election and lost by 100 votes. And I was really into local policy at that time, and so I knew I wasn't going to get a job in the Savannah government working on policy because I was with the opponent. And so I came back to Atlanta, and actually to the same neighborhood I was living previous to that, just over in the Decatur area, maybe 2 miles away from where we're at today. And I was welcomed by my landlord. She said, "It was great that you're back in Atlanta, Decatur, but I'm selling the house and you're going to have to move in 2 months." But she said, "Don't worry, I got a friend over in Clarkston who just needs someone to rent a room. They had a break-in in the neighborhood. She doesn't feel safe. She would like to have a roommate." And I said, "Well, how much is it going to cost?" $400 a month. And I was like, sold. And so by that time I was working and running a campaign for the statewide Public Service Commission election for Steve Oppenheimer against Chuck Eaton. Y'all remember Chuck Eaton? He just got reelected last year. And while I was working in that campaign, I was living in Clarkston. And I'm kind of a political nerd and geek, and I've done it all other places I've lived in my life. I went to the city council meeting for fun to see what was going on in this new city that I live in. And I knew that Clarkston was very diverse. And when I came to that council meeting, one, I found a council chamber that had hardly anyone in it. All right, but the people that were there actually pretty much all looked like me. It was white people. The entire city council was white. And they had a mayor who was kind of me and him are friends now, but I just described him as a crotchety old mayor who just didn't no one liked, right? And I remember going up to the council members afterwards, and I was like, clearly you guys don't like the mayor. Is anyone going to run against him? He seems like he's a really awful person. And no one was going to run against him. And it wasn't until later on in 2013 when we were having a block party in my neighborhood, and some cars were speeding down one of the roads going into our neighborhood on a hill, and the neighbors kind of lamented, "Oh, we only get some speed bumps in our neighborhood, things will be a little bit safer for the kids. And they said, oh, we've got a great idea, Ted. We think you should go ask the mayor for speed bumps. Because you're an advocate and activist, you know how to talk to elected officials. And I said, that's a great idea. I'm going to go talk. I'll do that. Yeah, that sounds like fun. And so I went and met with the mayor at the nearby Waffle House. And I said, look, we really need speed bumps and this and that. And you want to make it safer? And he said, no. He said, but if the neighbors want to pay for it, y'all could do that. That's allowed. It'll be $15,000. And I was like, oh, we don't have $15,000. That's why we pay taxes for infrastructure and safety improvements. And so I went back to my neighbors and kind of told them they're not gonna do the speed bumps. And then my neighbor said, we've got a great idea, Ted. We want you to run for mayor. And I said, that's a great idea. And so I ran for mayor in 2013, started my campaign in the summer. We had actually just finished the 2013 Integrated Resource Plan at the Public Service Commission, where I was working for a solar company advocating for more solar energy in Georgia. And that was actually the moment at the Public Service Commission where they said, you know what, maybe we should invest in solar energy. And that was the first big investment that we had won in 450 megawatts of solar. And from that July, went right into knocking on doors in Clarkston, Georgia. And I'll never forget, one of the first doors I knocked on was in a neighborhood that had been in Clarkston for about 30 years, and it was a very diverse population. And by the way, Clarkston's known as the most ethnically diverse square mile in America. 50% foreign-born, 40 nationalities, 60 different languages. So of course, knowing this about Clarkston and seeing the representation, I was confused about why people weren't showing up or why there was no representation from the international population. And it became clear to me when I knocked on the door of an older Vietnamese woman who didn't speak very good English, but she communicated enough to me that she really didn't feel like anyone bothered. But she was glad that I came by. But we were having some translation issues. I wasn't able to really communicate and really get from her what it is that she wanted the city government to do. And so luckily I got connected with a friend of a friend who was a master's student of public health at Emory, whose parents were Vietnamese refugees, and he's second generation American. And he spoke enough Vietnamese to go with me to sit in the living room with this older Vietnamese woman who kind of was like an elder in the community. And so we sat down in her living room and talked for about 2 hours. And she basically just said that our community doesn't participate in city government because no one ever asks us. No one ever bothers to ask us what we think. And I said, well, that's why I'm here. That's why I want to hear from you. And so 2 hours went by and we had a good conversation. And my Brian, my master's student, was helping translate this. And she said, thank you so much for coming by. I'll think about voting for you. And on election day in Clarkston, and by the way, we actually translated our campaign flyer into Vietnamese. And there's about 60 or so Vietnamese registered voters in Clarkston whose voting history showed they had never voted in city elections. And on election day, I'll never forget, we have one voting precinct in Clarkston at the time, and it was at the International Bible Church, and there's this wall of candidates before you get to within the 150-foot barrier, trying to get last-minute votes, people coming in to vote. And I'm in that scrum. I'm trying to talk to people that I hadn't connected with at the door. And throughout the day, some older Vietnamese residents would show up and they would kind of walk around the wall and go in and vote and come back out. And then the older Vietnamese woman showed up about midday, and she walked from the nearby neighborhood. And she walked around the wall, went in to vote, and as she walked out, she looked at me and she went, and I was like, oh my God, I think I might actually win this thing. And I got 52% of the vote, which in Clarkston is about 15, 20 votes away from winning or losing. And at that time in Clarkston in 2013, there was a moratorium on refugee resettlement. We had a mayor who said, we don't want any more refugees in Clarkston. It's causing too much drain on our city services. And I didn't necessarily run a campaign of, we need more refugees. It was a campaign for safer streets and safer sidewalks because I wanted to get those speed bumps, remember? But when I was sworn in, the first act that we passed as a city council was we got rid of that moratorium, and we sort of gave our local consent again to the State Department, to the federal government, that Clarkston would like to continue receiving refugees, because that is a huge aspect of what makes Clarkston what it is. And the inclusion and the outreach to just this Vietnamese community didn't just stop there. It went into the Eritrean community and the Somali community, the Ethiopian community, the Burmese community, the Arabic-speaking community. Literally chart the course of human and world events over the last 40 years. And Clarkston has people and families who have fled violence, political and religious persecution, cartels, increasingly climate disruption. And we have welcomed people from those countries to start their lives over. And not all of them stay in Clarkston, but some do. And so that 40 nationalities, 60 languages is represented in Clarkston. And we've made an effort to try to include as many people as possible. And number one, it was good for me because I won the election, all right? But it wasn't just about winning the election. It was about trying to make sure that all the voices of the people who pay taxes, who live in our city, were represented. And I'm proud to say that today we have a Somali American on our city council, an Eritrean on the city council. Our chairman of our planning and zoning board is a Bhutanese gentleman, the first ever. This last council election, we recruited two new Americans, one who had been a citizen for just 2 months from Ethiopia, ran for city council. He didn't make it by like 12 votes, and the other gentleman from Nepal, who had been a citizen for a couple of years, ran. But those voices were so important to bring up into the public discourse and how we make our policy. And that's the kind of representation that I want to bring to Washington. We have a president, we have a senator, Senator David Perdue. He's known as really the most anti-immigrant senator that no one's really ever heard of, because he's a freshman and he's not on Sean Hannity and MSNBC or Fox News all the time. But when it comes down to immigration, him and Tom Cotton are the leaders of the Merit Act, which is reducing legal immigration. They support cutting refugee resettlement numbers, which Trump has done, from 110,000 on average when President Obama and President George W. Bush were president, down to this year 16,000 refugees will be resettled in America between October and October of next year. And this is a point in our history and world history where we have the worst refugee crisis in the modern era. You have to go back to the aftermath of World War II to see this many number of families in flight. And America is stepping back from our leadership role in the world. The way that we talk about immigrants, the strangers, as if they were going to change the America that we grew up in. And I would argue that the hospitality, the compassion, the hand of opportunity that we give these families who have literally lost everything and literally cannot go back home is so rewarding to them and so important for them. But I think that we, at the very least, get as much out of it. In fact, actually, I think we get even more out of it as a country, because our country is a nation of immigrants. And that's the kind of principle and vision that I want to fight for in the United States Senate. I'm happy that I can talk all day long about my progressive policies in Clarkston. First, to raise the minimum wage to our first city employees to $15 an hour. First, to decriminalize marijuana. First, to make Election Day a holiday. One of the few cities to outlaw LGBTQ discrimination. To make a commitment to 100% clean energy transition. And we even, in about 2 months now, will have the first tiny home neighborhood development in Georgia. Which is an effort to create more housing affordability and accessibility. And actually on Tuesday we'll be introducing a plastic bags ban, basically, to reduce single-use packaging. So the things that we've been able to do in Clarkston are literally the only things that we can do with local control. There's so much that's been preempted by the state and federal government. And so we've been we're waiting for progress from DC or from Nathan Deal or Brian Kemp in the legislature. No action on the things that we care about. Clarkston has tried to lead by example, but we've hit a wall. There's only so much that we can do. And we've got to change the state house. We have an opportunity to flip the State House here in Georgia next year. That's a big part of my campaign strategy. We need to make sure that those 21 House districts, I know Becky knows them very well, have the support and have the coordinated campaign that we need in order to turn out votes like we've never seen before. And that's a big part of my strategy, my theory of change. I will happily declare that I'm the progressive candidate in the race. I'm the only candidate that's supporting Medicare for all. The only candidate that is supporting and has a history of supporting the Green New Deal, a $15 minimum wage, canceling student debt and having a debt-free public college system, and then ending not just corporate control of our democracy. Yes, we have to overturn Citizens United, but actually getting all private contributions out of our elections. We have to go to a truly publicly financed system. And that actually probably is the most important thing that we can do. Because if you look at other countries, particularly countries that have, for instance, universal healthcare systems, right? Just name a modern society and they have some form of universal healthcare coverage. And then look at how those countries run their elections. Well, number one, they have a public, non-biased, an entity that draws maps, that creates districts, that they have a publicly financed system. The level of corruption, whether through lobbying or dark money or campaign contributions, does not exist in those countries. And so what happens is evidence-based policies and solutions win out. Whereas when you talk about the things that I'm running on, things that actually are pretty popular, particularly among Democrats, when you talk about the things that actually will save us money, the investments we need to make in our society, in our people, those are things that evidence shows are the best investments. But we continue not to make those policy changes. Why? Because we have one of the most corrupt democracies in the entire world. And it means that things won't change. And so I'm not only going to fight for the progressive policies like a universal healthcare system, action on climate, a truly universal education system, but to get that corruption out of our politics. And I ask for y'all's votes. My website's tedforgeorgia.com. I'm Mayor Ted. I'm running for Georgia, and I'm running for you. Thank you very much. We got 30 minutes or so.
Any questions?
Oh, yeah, I have a question.
Questions or comments too? Critiques?
So how do you win this?
Well, first you got to win a primary. So there's 4 Democrats in the race right now, and just a sign of how winnable this seat is, the National Republican Senatorial Committee has put out, if you follow me or probably the other candidates on Twitter, you may have noticed that they put out a sort of a comic book villain kind of graphic where they've called Sarah Riggs-Amico the failure, John Ossoff the liar, Teresa Tomlinson the radical, and I'm the socialist. So here we are, a year from the election, and they're already attacking us. If they weren't concerned, they would just let us go. But they're literally attacking all 4 of us. And so, one, they know that they're vulnerable. The last AJC poll that was released 2 weeks ago, David Perdue is at 40%. Okay, so he's already, losing. People are not happy with Trump, and him and Trump are tied at the hip. They're best buddies. Okay, everything that Trump supports, David Perdue supports. All right, he has to. All right, this is the Republican Party they live in, and so they're going to rise and fall together. Now, when it comes to a Democratic primary, I'm a big believer that the Democratic nominee should represent the Democrats. And the poll that the AJC put out had a couple, I think, encouraging things for my campaign anyway. 62% of Georgia Democrats support Medicare for all. And they didn't, there was no qualifier, there was no explanation. They just said, do you support Medicare for all? Yes, no, maybe. 62% of Democrats support Medicare for all. 46% of independents support Medicare for all. And 15% of Republicans support Medicare for all. So that's interesting. Now, you back up for the whole population, 53% of all Georgians oppose Medicare for all. Okay, so there is something to overcome there. But I want to represent the Democrats in Georgia. Stacey Abrams, I think, proved that, and she actually says this in her Abrams playbook. Y'all should definitely check that out. 16 pages of really good strategic wisdom. But one of the passages says that we didn't just focus on the likely persuadable voters in the middle. We talked to all voters. And so, she ran as an unapologetic Democrat. Okay, there was not like a lot of centrist sort of triangulating message. She ran on policies that were inspiring and that the Democratic Party and Democratic constituents wanted to see. And so I think we need to take those messages, things like a universal healthcare system, directly to those independents, which are split 50-50 on issues like Medicare for all. The 15% of Republicans that are open to it, we need to bring them over to our side. Healthcare continues to be the number one issue for a lot of people. And it's not just people who have no insurance, it's the people who, like a supporter of mine told me the other day, they had this great news. It was a few months ago. Their wife is pregnant, but they're worried that if she gives birth just a few days into the next calendar year, their deductible resets. And they're going to have to pay at least $12,000. People who are underinsured, or the premiums are just so high, or the deductibles are so high that it's almost like you don't even have health care. And then there's the other reality of the fact that whether it's the pharmaceutical companies, the health insurance companies, not only do they spend more than almost any other sector of our economy in lobbying and campaign contributions, but they also made $100 billion in profits last year. And this is profits in a healthcare system that consistently, while having some of the best doctors and hospitals and care in the world, it's not for everybody. It's for people who can afford it. And if you go to the 6, area rural hospitals that have closed in Georgia, if you go to some of the counties that only have one primary care physician or no OBGYNs, those are places where I think we need to talk about how a universal health care system would mean that their health care would be improved because the current system isn't working. And we know David Perdue and Donald Trump have no solution other than just repeal Obamacare and just let the market figure it out. Well, that's not working. So that's how we went.
Right.
Yes.
And Medicare right now has the traditional Medicare has the 80% that Medicare covers, and then you buy a supplement from a private company. So I don't understand. I mean, you'd still have to keep private companies, wouldn't you? At least.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at Canada, Australia, Germany, Israel, Sweden, all of those healthcare systems, one, they're universal, so no one gets left behind. But they're all basically dual payer systems.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's all some element of a private supplemental, okay? The Australians have a very interesting sort of mechanism. They have a 2% wealth tax. Everyone has a 2% income tax. Now, if you are lower income or middle class, you don't pay that tax. If you're very wealthy, you pay a penalty to leave the system, but you don't leave with your money. And so at least that money is still going into, the insurance pool, which is the whole purpose of insurance. The more people that are in it, the lower risk for everybody. And then some of those wealthy Australians will go out and get their boutique, health insurance, their boutique care. Sweden, they have 3 different levels of funding, whether from the federal, provincial, or even to the local level. And so there's some municipalities in Sweden that have decided to tax themselves more because they want to provide even more care and options for their local people. Germany has a whole system and network of doctors that negotiate based on regional differences. And so, when we talk about Medicare for all, and whether you're supporting Bernie's plan or Warren's plan or even the public option plans, all right, all the Democrats are saying we want to get to universal health care coverage, all right? And so I want to start with the end in mind. I want to start with where we want to go. And of course, when you get to the Senate and you have to get, 60 votes maybe to stop a filibuster, although I would be very much in favor of just forgetting the filibuster. if we know we have the majority of Americans with us on, policy issues, forget the filibuster. Let's pass something, all right, and start moving ourselves to a universal system. And so, yeah, there's issues in Medicaid and Medicare that are problematic, that either don't fund at the full rate, that don't cover everything they're supposed to. And so, we have to work those things out. The last thing I'll say on universal health care coverage, and this is probably the biggest reason that I started out as a public option guy, but went to say, no, we need to go as fast as we can to universal health care. And it's for the experience I had working as a nursing assistant in college. I was very fortunate to work as a CNA at a long-term care facility for 3 years in college. We had a long-term care wing, a dementia wing, and a rehab wing. And I was also in the union, so our collective bargaining unit had worked out a way where I could work a double shift every Saturday from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. and I get paid $17 an hour. And as a college student, I was like, this is fantastic. Like I could, graduate debt-free and have enough to, take my girlfriend out for pizza, on a Friday night. But what I saw then, which is I think even worse today, is how we treat the most vulnerable in our society, which is our elders. And the current reality is that we have 45 million Americans who are going to be retiring and aging in place and are going to need some type of long-term care, which is the most expensive part of Medicaid and Medicare. And this is over the next 25 years. And Medicare, so Social Security as a trust fund is actually doing really good. You can make some minor tweaks to it, and Social Security will be good for the next 60 years. Medicare is not the same way. Medicare has been underfunded. And the only way that our society can actually cover in a dignified way 45 million Americans who are going to need long-term care and create a system where we don't shove them all into nursing homes, but we provide actual home care and continuity of care and a greater aging in place transition, is we have to have a universal system. We have to have more young people. We have to have more, younger people in general paying into the system. It's the only way that we can afford as a country to deal with that. And I'll just, my personal experience, when I was working at this nursing home, that was right when it was right at the time when my grandmother, who, by the way, was the town beautician in Shipley, Florida for 40 years. She was the breadwinner for my mom's, her twin sister, and her older sister growing up. My grandfather fought in World War II, but he had really traumatic PTSD from that, and he really never had a job. And so she took care of the family. She provided the opportunities that my mom and her and my aunts, got. And when she retired, she had saved up enough to where she bought a house 2 blocks from the beach in Panama City, Florida. Had this beautiful little beach house, and we would visit her for summers and holidays. But she had COPD, and she was developing issues with that, and we couldn't afford for the home care that she much rather would have liked to have had. And the system at the time, and still is a system today, is Medicaid doesn't kick in until you're poor. And so she had to sell the house, sell everything that she pretty much owned, and we transitioned her into a nursing facility. And she didn't want that. She did not want that. And so we moved her in, one night, and she died the next day. And if I think back on the type of country and the society that I want to live in, it would have been one where she could have stayed in her house, in her home, and we could have kept visiting her. But everything was going health-wise, the transition, just feeling alone, all of that just compounded, and it wasn't the way it should have been. And the kind of world I want to live in is one where we take care of each other. And so that's where I think we should go.
This is sort of a technical question.
Yeah.
Do you differentiate when you say Medicare for all and universal health care coverage?
Well, it's
Do you
it's
use
be-
those
it's-
interchangeably?
it's become kind of a bumper sticker at this point, all right? Because if you look at Warren's plan and Bernie's plan, all right, there's some funding differences, but it is a universal healthcare system. And when you say Medicare for all, it's just a rhetorical device where people know what that means. People know what Medicare is. I mean, in a lot of ways, if you want to be really technical about it, what we're kind of talking about really is Medicaid for all. That's going to be Medicaid for all for most people. But some people think Medicaid is awful. And it is awful in Georgia because it doesn't cover everybody. It's like one of the most lowest funded Medicaid states, in the entire country. And so, it's at this point it's become a slogan, easily interpreted from the masses out there who have 2 jobs, who have to take care of their kids, or have to pay the rent, the mortgage, or worrying about all these other things. It's kind of like that old Rodney Dangerfield joke. He said, hurting you is the last thing I'd want to do, but it's still on the list. All right, like voting and following these issues is what people really want to do it, but it's just like at the bottom of the list. They have to go through all this other stuff in their lives. And so that's one of the challenges we have, when it comes to voter engagement. 47% of America didn't vote in 2016. Right? 47% of eligible Americans did not vote. It was 23.5 and 23.6 for Hillary and Trump, and then Gary Johnson and Jill Stein got the rest of it. But how do we get those people? And some of it's we have to be smart little marketers and rhetorical, and others we have to outwork them. That's why I'm wearing my red shoes. These are my canvassing shoes. If anyone's ever knocked on a door, Okay, all right. I've knocked on thousands of doors in my life, and when you knock on a door, you never know what you're going to get. Sometimes people open in their underwear with a shotgun. They're generally like, "Why are you bothering me?" But I always, I always think of ways that I can try to bring down the guard. And the best tactic I've ever discovered is wear, kind of random, weird-looking shoes. These red shoes. People look at it, oh, cool red shoes. Why are you here? And so, any way that we can to kind of, to bring down the barriers, we can. That's how we're really going to win.
From some of the ads I've seen on television and on the internet, I think that there's some confusion between socialized medicine and Medicare, where people are thinking that somehow they're going to have to go to doctors that belong to the federal government or something, rather than continuing in an insurance system. As far as I know, the only socialized medicine we have in the States is the VA, and some of the programs for Native Americans. And then Medicare and Medicaid, the 2 names are so much alike, I think it's a lot of confusion.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah, socialized medicine would be, closer to like England and Japan, where the doctors are employees of the state. The VA has been hit hard by some issues in some of their regions with substandard care. Atlanta, has its own issues. But some of the VA systems are some of the most remarkably run healthcare systems in the world. I met someone the other day whose grandfather was in the Alabama, West Georgia, Mississippi kind of VA region. And she was like, this was the best care that he's ever gotten his entire life. And so, it's, our veterans, our military, they have access to, government doctors. And it's in some regions, if it's, when it's run by good people who care, who believe in what they do, which I think is kind of like, I met a nurse down in Tifton, Georgia, and she's like, I'm spending 25% of my time, dealing with insurance paperwork and all the other little payers and this and that. And I think what we're talking about is we want to create something where like doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals can do what they love to do, and they don't have to deal with all of the BS and the bureaucracy. And so, I think there is a way that we can do that, and if that's the goal, then we should fight for it. And we shouldn't, capitulate about whether socialized medicine is bad. We should highlight the things that are working in all the healthcare systems. We should invite people and professionals from Israel, from Australia, from France, some of the most highly rated healthcare systems in the world, and then let's invite the VA people to come as well and tell us about things that they're doing and use those best practices to make our healthcare system the greatest in the entire world for everybody. Yes, Martha.
Yeah, what's really calling you or driving you to be a U.S. Senator rather than State House or whatever? What's pulling you there? And what about you do we need to know is going to make you a good thing? Not your experience, but you.
Yeah. Well, I'll answer the last question first. I'm not taking any corporate PAC money or corporate lobbyist money. So, and I think almost every Democrat's at that stage now, except maybe Joe Biden. So you know that I'm going into an office where I haven't already, made deals with special interest groups whose sole purpose in lobbying and campaigning and campaign contributions is to get what they want out of the government. So that's number one. What's calling me to be in the Senate? Honestly, like I was much more resigned to just finishing up my term as mayor. And then when they redraw the districts in 2021, maybe have an opportunity to run for something higher in 2022. But whether it's the Trump administration, whether it's David Perdue just being so awful, whether it's just the fact that I think like the voice of the progressive part of the Democratic Party, if I didn't run, I think that there would be some issues that would be missing from the debate. And so, it's kind of rare to see a white man in power give up his power, for someone else. And so the people in Clarkston, who it's a very diverse city council, like when I run for Senate in March, we have to resign. And maybe a younger, person of color or a former refugee can run for mayor, and that would be a great day for Clarkston. And me running, I mean, it's kind of risky, right? But, I'm also 36 years old, so, I'm like not in a huge hurry. But I do think that the issues that I'm running on, if I wasn't running, they wouldn't be talked about. And I'm worried that we won't. I'm worried that there's a lot of Democrats out there and a lot of new Georgia residents who maybe come from more progressive-minded states that are looking for a Democrat to run, not someone who's going to kind of try to straddle the line because we have to get back Trump voters. I don't think Stacey Abrams really tried to get Trump voters.
No.
I think she tried to inspire the people that haven't been voting, the disaffected voters, the unregistered voters. And that's my theory of change. I think at this point in our politics, I'm sad to say it, but it's kind of you're either with us or against us mentality. And for running an election, I think in Georgia in 2020, you got to turn out the base. Now, after you win an election and you're a senator for 6 years, hopefully there's opportunities to bring people together on things that we actually can agree on. I hope.
So do you have to resign before the primary?
When you qualify in Georgia, like you sign the paper that you're running, you effectively resign any position that you have.
Except for Secretary of State.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, the one caveat is if you're... Yes, thank you. If you're in your last year of office, then you don't have to resign. You can complete that. Yeah, if you're up for re-election that year, you can still run and you can still be Secretary of State.
Can we do one more question?
Yes.
Just to
Yes. Or comment.
Okay, then.
Okay.
Oh,
Or
go ahead.
advice. I'll take advice too.
Okay, I'm guessing that your first priority with respect to criminal justice reform is legalizing marijuana?
Yeah, legalize marijuana. Yeah.
What would 2, 3, and 4 be?
Well, so in the vein of legalized marijuana, so a couple of things. I think that we need to have full restitution and expungement from the war on drugs. The systems in other states where they have legalized, and some states, big corporations have been able to move in and sort of take control of the marketplace, and in others they've kept it very grassroots. I think that we should have affirmative action for people that have been unjustly caught up in the war on drugs, and the federal licensing system. We should have a federal licensing system for legalization of who can grow, whether it's hemp or cannabis, or be in the market of selling and distributing in that legal way. The majority of the licenses should go to people that have been impacted by the war on drugs, and this is going to be mostly black and brown people. This is part of my reparations policy. So that's one aspect of my reparations policy. The other is informed by a really great book called The Color of Law, which came out last year. And he makes a really strong case. I mean, there are people alive today that were legally discriminated against by the federal, state, or local government. Atlanta is an example, but Baltimore, and it goes beyond redlining. It's exclusionary zoning. And people have literally been, black, and this is mostly black Americans, have been boxed out of home ownership simply because they are black. And so either we give them the right to sue, for that restitution, or we just create a National Fair Share Housing Act, which is sort of outlined in The Color of Law, but there would be some other layers to it, where we would prioritize investment in home ownership opportunities for black Americans. And this, I think, is a smart and practical reparations policy, because you don't have to kind of figure out, what member of your family was a slave and how much work did they do and all that stuff. I mean, there's a study committee that's supposed to kind of work their way through that. But anytime you hear a politician say they want to do a study committee, it means they want to just deal with it some other time. And so I'll support the Conyers bill that now is the Sheila Jackson-Lee bill to have that reparations study committee. But I think on housing and the war on drugs, we can begin to address legal, discrimination by the government in those two areas. The other parts of criminal justice reform, honestly, the thing that I wish I had time and wish I had more of the support to do in Clarkston was a thing called civilian-led policing. And civilian-led policing is kind of a radical idea, but it's not that radical when you think about it. And what it says is that the police chief, all right, this is where when we're talking about criminal justice reform, we're talking about changing policing. The federal and state governments have little levers of funding, but local policing is a local policy. And that's how we were able to decriminalize marijuana. We just told our police that this is now a ticket-only offense. Do not arrest for marijuana possession. Give them a $75 ticket and be on their way. That was a local policy that we direct, and of course they're gonna follow the local leaders. Almost every policing system in this country, the police chief is hired by either the strong mayor or a city manager. But in a civilian-led policing environment, a civilian-led board is bifurcated from the political and and maybe the more corrupt elements of local governments, and you actually recruit and place people on this civilian-led board that represent the community, and their job is to hire the police chief. So the police chief is directly accountable to the civilians, not the politicians who have to come up for a vote every 4 years. It's literally to the people that are there to protect and serve. And I think that bifurcation takes politics out of it. I think it puts a more direct line of communication between people and communities who are saying, we're not getting the support that we need. And I think you can begin to actually change policing to what I would like to see, which is more of an army of social workers than an army of militarized people. I mean, body cameras are great, but I talk to so many police who say, I wish I actually could spend more of my time helping deal with the problems that I'm trying to triage. They know, I mean, when you talk about police athletic leagues, investment in giving police more hours just to spend time with children, and be coaches and mentors and not out patrolling. We need to spend less time arresting and giving tickets and more time actually being those leaders, because police are out there 24/7, 365. I mean, they know more than I know about Clarkston or about any city because they see it. But they have such limited scope of authority to actually solve those problems. And so we got to empower them. And I think civilian-led policing actually would begin to change the policy making, where a police chief would be more with the people, have to spend more time answering to the people, and as a result, police will just change in terms of who you hire, what is accepted, what's tolerated, and I think we can begin to actually make a more just criminal justice system.
Wonderful.
Great question, Carol.
So.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We're gonna give Ted a necessary trouble t-shirt for all the trouble he's made in the past.
Oh, good.
And all the
Keep making trouble.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Becky.
Thank you.
I appreciate that.
Thank you for being such a great advocate for immigrants and refugees.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we are gonna take about a 5-minute break. 5-minute break. Say goodbye to Ted. There is